Everybody, so today we're going to talk about voting and elections and then how we nominate candidates for office. So let me just pull up this PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to use about voting. Let's see if I can start the slideshow from the beginning. So let's talk about voting. The original Constitution says very little about who can vote and who can't vote. Pretty much it was left up to the states. And for the most part, the states had the same things. So you had to be around 21, you had to be male, you had to be white, and you had to be a landowner. The idea was if you weren't a landowner, where would you get the right to tell somebody what they could do with their land? Well, by 1860, almost all white males over 21 could vote. They'd eased a lot of those restrictions on land ownership, mainly because more cities were popping up and people didn't necessarily own land. In 1863, after the Civil War starts, we get the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in rebellious territories. What this did was it allowed for freed slaves, to join the Union Army. And about 200,000 do, 38,000 die. And so if you were able to die for your country, should you have the right to vote? And so Congress passes the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says that the right to vote cannot be denied on race, creed, color, or previous condition of servitude. You could still deny it based on gender. Well, the southern states did not like this. They argued that freedmen didn't have the education or the knowledge to be effective voters, which was probably true, but that was also true for millions of southern white voters and northern white voters. So southern states started adding black codes, or sometimes Jim Crow laws, usually based on the Mississippi Plan, which was designed to stop poor people, minorities from voting, and in a broader sense to keep the trappings of slavery. So let's talk about some of these restrictions that they came up with. Well, the first one was the grandfather clause. Now the grandfather clause said that if your grandfather wasn't eligible to vote in the 1860 election, then you would not be eligible to vote. Well, of course, 1860 is before they abolished slavery. Therefore, if your grandfather was not a slave, you would not be eligible to vote. The grandfather clause held up until about 1919 in the Supreme Court case of Gwynn versus Oklahoma, in which it was struck down. Another idea was the poll tax. And the poll tax was a fee that you had to pay before you could vote. You had to register, and if you can look closely enough, I don't know if you can see it on this, this was from January 1901. You would pay that tax in January, even though you wouldn't vote until November. And if you lost that, then it was gone. And as you can see on this one, well, maybe you can't, but that poll tax in 1900 was $1. Well, many African Americans couldn't afford $1, therefore they weren't able to vote. And it also kept poor whites from voting. Think about it, if you had $1 back then could buy you a week's worth of groceries, was it worth voting or worth eating? The poll tax in federal elections was struck down by the 24th Amendment, and then in state elections in subsequent Supreme Court cases. Then there was the literacy test, where you had to pass a test before you were registered to vote. Now, you could maybe be able to see this test, but it was used in a lot of southern states, not Texas. But one of the questions here is divide a vertical line in two equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot bisectional of the vertical. Well, as you can imagine with questions like that, a lot of people couldn't pass it. And it also meant that a lot of white people couldn't pass it. So they added a clause in there saying, it was what they called the general understanding clause, that if the registrar of voters felt that you had a general understanding of the system, you could be exempt from taking the test. Well, how did they know if you had a general understanding? You were white. That's how they could tell. The literacy test was eventually suspended by the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Another thing that came up was with the white primary. This came out of Texas. Texas was a one-party state run by the Democrats after the Civil War, and they argued that the Democratic Party was a private club, open only to, oddly enough, white people. And since only members of the party could vote in the party's primary, then only white people could vote. This was eventually struck down in the case of Smith versus Allwright in 1944 as part of the NAACP's double V program, which is V for victory over the Nazis and V over victory over discrimination at home. A lot of states would have residency requirements, saying that you had to live in a place for more than a year before you could vote. This, of course, hurt sharecroppers and tenant farmers because they moved from place to place, and a lot of people didn't stay at a place for a year. Today, it's the maximum residency requirement is 30 days in federal elections and 55 in local elections, but most states go with 30 as the maximum. The 19th Amendment, well, hang on, let me back this up for a second. So we've moved away now from all these attempts to prevent African-American voting, and it was very effective. 90% of African-Americans in Alabama were not eligible to vote according to these laws up until the 1950s. Now we're going to expand the franchise even more into what we call universal suffrage. Universal suffrage is the right of everybody to vote of a legal age. Of course, the 19th Amendment recognized women's right to vote, and women had, Wyoming was the first territory and then the first state to grant women the vote. Women used the so-called purity argument, arguing that since women were morally superior than men, according to Victorian tradition, if you gave women the right to vote, what they would do is they would clean up politics. And then we got the 26th Amendment, which was at the height of the Vietnam War, and they argued, look, if you can be drafted and fight and die for your country, you should have a say-so in that war policy. And that say-so is the vote. So that lowered the voting age to 18. So today, before we get to the next slide, today we almost have complete universal suffrage. You have to be at least 18 to vote, a US citizen and a resident of your state. Some states, local governments are looking at 16-year-olds to vote because do 16-year-olds have jobs? Yes. Do they pay taxes? Yes. Do they get representation? No. So they have no taxation without representation. We still deny certain people the vote, people that are in prison, obviously, people that are homeless because they have no residency. You have to have a residency for the registrar to know where you're supposed to vote. And then, of course, those who have been judged mentally incompetent are ineligible to vote. But for the most part, it's universal suffrage. So that brings us to one of the latest things today is, and that's the idea of this voter fraud. And going through the COVID crisis, you know, they've been talking about mail-in ballots, and people are afraid that there's voter fraud. Well, when you look at this is a 2012 poll of how common voter fraud is. And for Democrats, 40% think it's somewhat common or very common. Independents, 47%, and Republicans, 58%. And this is, 8 years ago, so those numbers have probably gone up a little bit. But how common is it? Well, if you looked at all the elections for all 50 states for 12 years, that's a long time. That's a lot of elections. That's 1 billion votes, right? A bit more than 1 billion votes. Of those billion of votes, you had about 2,000 cases of accused election fraud. The highest being the 23% absentee ballot fraud, which meant that somebody filled out a ballot for somebody else, maybe on purpose. Maybe that person was invalid or couldn't write, but you're not supposed to do that. Voter registration fraud, people thinking they're eligible to vote, but they can't. Non-citizens who think they're eligible, but they can't. It's a very small percentage. And then in-person voter fraud. Now, this is the interesting one here, 0.5% out of 2,000 cases. That's almost non-existent. So there's this constant myth of voter fraud, that it's non-existent, really. Mail-in voting is no different. We've seen that 5 states have done mail-in voting forever, and they have very little problems with it. So when we look at voter fraud, excuse me, you can see that it's very rare. More people see UFOs, more people are hit by lightning. So the question then becomes is why have voter ID, right? Why are you saying you need to see this picture before I could vote? Well, it's always that parties, and we saw for a long time the Democrats were trying to stop people from voting. Parties are always trying to stop people from voting. And here, when you look at people who lack IDs, you can look at the estimates here, and some of these high estimates in Harris County, 19%, El Paso, 38% may not have a valid license. And that tends to, across the country, has tended to benefit Republican candidates. So again, Democrats and Republicans have always tried to, prevent people from voting if they can, because they don't think it's in their best interest. For a long time it was Democrats, right now it's Republicans. This is nothing unusual. So let's talk about voter turnout. And we can talk about voter turnout as being very, very low. Most Texans don't vote. If you look at these numbers here, there's about 28 million Texans, and in a primary, less than 1 million vote. So a very small percentage. You can see here, these are the presidential turnout rates. In 1960, it was 63%. The last time we got our highest one was Obama versus McCain at 56%. And so usually only about half the people vote. And when you compare that to around the world, you can see that top blue line there, that's America. It's fairly low. Australia is at about 85, Austria 85, Belgium 85, Canada 68, Denmark 83, Finland 79, France 67, Germany 80%, India 59%. The countries that are low are lower than the United States are Switzerland, strangely enough, and Mexico. So we have a low turnout in this country. And this chart, if you look at it very carefully, it shows us that since 1972 to 2012, that in presidential elections, we have not exceeded a 50% voter turnout. Half the people in Texas haven't voted for president. And you can see where we rank at the bottom, we're now at 49. And then when we're electing governors, we call these midterm elections, when we're electing governors and members of Congress, like in 2018, you can see the turnout in Texas is also low again. We're number 50th. And the turnout across the country is even low, and only about 1/3 of the people voting. And that doesn't include any things like local elections. Like when I run for mayor, the turnout's usually about 10%. In some places, 2%. Same way with primary elections, which we'll talk about later. So why low turnout? That's what this dog wants to know. There's a lot of reasons. When we vote, we usually vote on a Tuesday. People are working on a Tuesday. It makes it tough for them to go vote. There's a lot of people who just don't care. They don't think, whatever, I don't care, I'm busy with my life. See a lot of apathy out there. A lot of people think, well, my vote doesn't count. Well, a shift of 50,000 votes in 2016 would have made Hillary Clinton president, not Donald Trump. Even closer, if you look back here in 2000 in Florida, Florida was the state that flipped the election. 538 voters out of almost 6 million people voting. Were there 539 Democrats that sat at home and go, well, my vote doesn't count? Probably. My last mayor's election, I won by 14 votes out of 1,200. We had a councilwoman who won by just 1 vote. So your vote does count. A lot of ignorance out there. Remember, ignorance isn't a bad word. We're all ignorant about something. Just don't act on your ignorance. But a lot of people don't know when we're supposed to vote. Really don't. They don't keep up with elections. And some of it is election burnout. We do have a lot of elections and people just get tired of elections. In fact, we're almost in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 52 weeks a year election cycle where it's always campaigning. And people get election burnout, just so many elections. And here you can see why people don't vote. This is from 2014. They're too busy. They didn't like the candidates. They missed the deadline. They didn't have a way to get there. They had conflicts with work or school. All of those things pop up. So let's say we want to try to improve turnout, try to get more people voting. How can we do that? Well, you can also do same-day registration. If you look here, the states in red require you to register 30 days before the election. The states in green allow you to register to vote on election day, and it is shown to have a higher turnout if you allow people to vote, register to vote on election day. You could make election day a holiday. Some people have argued that. Make November 3rd or whatever that, November 4th, whenever the election is a holiday. This year's November 3rd, but make it a national holiday and have people there the whole time vote. Absentee balloting, allow people when they know they're not going to be around, or mail-in balloting to be able to fill in something and mail it in. We've been doing absentee balloting forever. Soldiers in World War II mailed in their ballots from absentee. There was somebody on the space station that mailed in a ballot. So I had friends who were in Iraq who mailed in a ballot. Right now in Texas, mail-in ballots only allow for those people who are over 65 and have a medical condition. But it is a debate right now going on with the current COVID crisis. Do you want to have a whole bunch of people in an election area when there's a possibility of infection, and that people shouldn't have to choose between their right to vote and their health? Something that was passed was the so-called motor voter that allows people to register to vote and get their driver's license at the same time. Ooh, I don't know if I want to get to online voting yet, but I will. Online voting. I know you worry about online voting if you get hacked, but you bank online, you shop online. Some places are trying online voting. We'll see how that plays out. Some places do compulsory voting. This is Australia. In Australia, they have compulsory voting where if you don't vote, it's a ticket. And another thing that we haven't mentioned, and I don't have a slide on this, is early voting, allowing people to vote 3 weeks up before the election at any time. So we're trying to find ways to increase turnout. So let's talk about elections 2020. So we're going to see a campaign election, a presidential elections, for example. Let's just use that. That's one people are most familiar with. It'll be Trump versus Biden, right? But how did those two people get to be their party nominees? How did anybody become a party nominee? Well, in the old days, they used something called a caucus. A caucus is a big fancy word meaning to meet. And party leaders would meet and decide who was going to be their candidate for a particular office. That's not very democratic, but that's how they did it. They didn't trust the public to do it. In the 1840s, or 1830s and 40s, they began the so-called convention system. The convention system is modeled after the religious revival of the Second Great Awakening. And what you would do is that you'd have a series of conventions. You'd have a county convention, a state convention, and a national convention. And in each one of these conventions, they would nominate people for the office that fit, county offices, state offices, or national office. And you would bring in delegates from all over the county or all over the state or all over the nation to come and make these decisions. That's more democratic, but it's also open to bribery and a lot of yes men. There were issues with that too. During the progressive era, they came up with a new idea, and that was the direct primary. Now, the direct primary allows voters to vote who's going to be the party nominee in November. We usually have our primaries in March. And so now the voters get to decide again for their party. And there are a lot of different types of primaries, as you can see on this chart. But the ones we want to talk about really are the closed primary and the open primary. And so we have primary elections in March. And there are two types that are prevalent around the country. The closed primary means that it's only open to party members, that you have to be a Democrat to vote in the Democratic Party. You have to be a Republican to vote in the Republican Party primary. So you have to be a member of the party. An open primary means that you can choose anyone you want to. You can go to the Republican or the Democrat. So the question is, which one do we have in Texas? And the answer is both. Legally in Texas, we operate a closed primary, but we don't put on your voter registration card what you are. You declare party allegiance, at least for that election only, when you go into the primary and you ask for the Democrat or Republican ballot. That's how you do it. Now, in a primary system, you have to get a majority of the vote. If you don't, then they have a runoff election. The top two candidates move on to a runoff election, usually in May in Texas. It's been pushed back to July because of the issues with our coronavirus this year in 2020. And then somebody will get a majority. Some places use a blanket primary where you can cross over to the different races. We're not interested in that. And then what we call a nonpartisan primary is when they don't put a party label on it. So who has to hold a primary? Does the Green Party have to hold a primary? No, anybody who received 20% of the last vote for governor has to hold a direct primary. The other groups, like the Libertarians or whatever, they can nominate their candidates any way they want to. Now, to get on the ballot, if you want to run for election, there's usually a fee so that they know that you're serious. U.S. Senator, you can see the fees here. Or you can go out and get a petition of signatures for each office, depending on which office you want, how many signatures you need. General elections, which we hold in November, are won by a plurality vote. Plurality means who gets the most votes wins. Now, when we get to the presidency, we can see that Donald Trump did not get a majority or a plurality, but he got a majority of the Electoral College, and that's how that system works. But normally a plurality means whoever gets the most votes. Okay, so that brings us to who runs the election. The election is usually run by the county, and then they can decide how they want the ballot to look. There's something called a party column ballot where everybody's all one party is listed on one side and all the other parties listed on the other side. That lends itself to straight ticket voting. People just go down and click all Republicans or all Democrats. Then there's an office block where they show each office, and then they show the Republican and Democrat, Libertarian, whoever else is running for that office, and they go up by office by office. This tends itself to what we call split ticket voting, where you vote for members of the Republicans and Democrats. We don't need to know about that, and we don't need to know about that, and we already talked about that. Okay, so that's voting and elections. Last thing we want to really talk about with voting and elections is campaign finance. In federal elections, there is a limit on how much you can donate to a candidate. It's around $2,700 per candidate. Now, some people will form political action committees. These are a group of like-minded people who pool their money and then contribute to a candidate. It has a little bit bigger impact. They can give a little bit more money. You can also spend as much of your own money you want on your campaign. This was decided in the case of Buckley versus Vallejo, that you really couldn't stop somebody from spending how much they want on their own campaign. You can understand why you would say, well, Bill Gates can't give me $500 million to run for president. That looks like he has undue influence. But if I gave myself $500 million, I really can't bribe myself by telling myself I can't. If I don't do this, I'm not going to give myself my money. See how confusing that statement was? I don't even understand it. So money has a corrosive element to politics. If you were to talk to politicians today, they will tell you they spend most of their time raising money and that you have to raise money for advertising. Now, strangely enough, in Texas, there's no limit on how much you can give. If you're running for state races, national is different, but state races, there's no limit on how much you can give. And so if I was running for mayor and somebody goes, hey, I want to give you $1 million, they can do that. But whenever you're running for office, you have to file reports, either the national level or the state level. And in those reports, it tells you, you have to tell how much money you've raised, who gave you what money, what's their address, what's their profession. All that has to be listed, and it's public record. And then you have to report where you spent all that money and how it was spent. And you have to file those reports. So it's a fairly open process. Now, lately we've had a problem with super PACs, and sometimes this is called dark money, because super PACs are different than regular PACs. Is that in a regular PAC, you have to record all this data about where you got the money and where you spent it. In a super PAC, that can be all secret. People can give $1 billion. The deal with a super PAC, as long as they don't coordinate with the campaign that they're supporting, let's say if they're supporting Trump or Biden, they can run all the ads they want without a direct endorsement. This leads to a lot of hidden money in politics that we don't know where it's coming from, and it's a controversial issue. So that's a quick summary of elections. We should briefly mention who votes, and I'm going to sum it up. There's a lot of breakdown on who's likely to vote, but for the test purposes, you need to know that usually people with college degrees tend to vote more than those who do not, and that people that have vested interest with the government, let's say you're a farmer and you're getting a subsidy, or you work in the defense industry and it's important to your job, you're more likely to vote. Those are the things that you should know. Now, the next lecture that we'll do is over the history of American political parties, and that should be fairly interesting, at least I do. So thanks for stopping in, and we'll talk more later.